All righty then. So, good evening once again to everyone. Welcome to Series 2, Class 5. This series is on karma and dependent arising, and this class is on the notion of reincarnation, which should be, I hope, very provocative. So I'd like to start off by recounting a brief story about my first teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche. One of his main teaching venues was what he called seminary, which was a 3-month program where it was residential. So people would leave their lives and go to one of the practice centers for 3 months. And there would be intensive periods of practice followed by intensive periods of study. And the last seminary he gave was in 1986. He died in April 4th, 1987. So this was a year before he died. He was already quite sick and fairly weak. And so at that particular seminary, Trungpa Rinpoche, he taught actually very little. He just gave very, very brief talks. But everyone said his presence was so strong. It was even stronger than if he was teaching a lot. So they called it the presence of the absence. But one particular night, Trungpa Rinpoche, in the middle of the night, called everybody up. And so they sent out, posse to wake everybody and to talk. And so I don't know what time this was, but it was truly in the middle of the night, and everybody at seminary was asleep, and they went and woke them all up, and they all gathered in the shrine room. And then Trungpa Rinpoche appeared, and he gave a 2-minute talk. And the topic was, don't forget the Hinayana. Don't forget the Hinayana. And then he told everyone, okay, you can go back to bed now. So it was very interesting that he found it so important to remind people of that in the middle of the night, that he woke them up and gathered them just for that particular teaching, which I was thinking about recently, and I thought how profound that is. And I'd like to define what he meant by the Hinayana, because we talk about the 3 yanas, the Hinayana, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana. Hinayana often has a pejorative connotation to it. Sometimes it's translated as the lesser vehicle, whereas Mahayana is the greater vehicle, and Vajrayana is the indestructible vehicle. And so there is a natural hierarchy of them. But in this case, Trungpa Rinpoche was pointing out to the profundity and the importance of the Hinayana. So when he defined Hinayana, he called it not the school of the elders like the Theravadan, not the lesser vehicle. He called it the narrow vehicle. And I always thought that was very interesting, because from his perspective, narrow means discipline. And it means learning what to accept and what to reject in order to go forward on your path. Remember the Hinayana. So in that sense, before we start the path of Dharma, we are we're just living our confused experience where we're bumping around like a leaf in the wind, following our thoughts and our desires, and without any particular direction. And according to the teaching of dependent arising, we go through the cycle of the nidanas from one life to another, endlessly accumulating karma and experiencing its results. So from that perspective, it's completely aimless existence without a dharmic path. Is completely aimless. You're wandering, and sometimes you have good experiences, sometimes you have negative experiences based upon the ripening of positive and negative karma. So this idea of the narrow vehicle is the confusion is like this, it's like a cloud, and it is all pervasive. And how do you get out? How do you get out of confusion? You get out of confusion through the path of the narrow vehicle. Because otherwise, there are millions of sidetracks. Try this. This is, we see all the time now in this kind of new agey world that someone has come up with the latest thing. They've combined the yoga practice of this with psychology of that and meditation of this, and it's the newest thing, and you've got to try this because it's even more effective. And that's not the narrow vehicle. The latest diet, the latest everything. Now, of course, it's fine to have a diet and be healthy, and it's great to do yoga. I'm not disparaging any of those things. But when they're presented as a spiritual path, it's just distraction. And they're distracting us from this. The way out of our suffering is what is most important. The way out. Trungpa Rinpoche used to always say also, the way out is the way in. So looking very closely at our situation. So in that sense, this narrowing of our focus to what is actually important. What's important on the path is learning how to discriminate what is beneficial and what is not beneficial. So this teaching on dependent arising falls squarely in the middle of that idea of the narrow path. That through this teaching, it's actually a complete description of the path and tells us in terms of, or gives us clues how to behave in terms of our conduct, positive and negative actions. Positive actions create virtue and happiness in the future, and create the situation where you can continue to practice Dharma. Negative actions or self-centeredness creates suffering and drags you down and adds more and more layers of confusion, so that you have much more difficulty practicing, or you don't even find the dharmic path. So this path of dependent arising, it teaches us conduct. It teaches us the proper view, that we begin to see the movement of our mind with some kind of clarity. Well, let's talk about meditation first. So it teaches us meditation, and we talked about how karma arises in terms of the nidana chain with klesha, karma, and suffering. So we begin to see in our own state of mind how the arising of a klesha or a negative emotion creates a tendency or karma, and that results in suffering. So we begin to see that in our meditation practice, and we start to apply awareness to that so that it becomes clear and is no longer hidden. And then this teaching provides us with the proper view of how to relate to that situation. And we begin to see that how we think and how we consider our experience, how we look at our mind is very much dependent upon our view and our intention. And we learn that we can actually improve our intention. We can have gradually have greater understanding and experience a view that's more in line with reality. So in other words, seeing that negative actions cause suffering and positive actions cause virtue, and seeing the root cause of that as of the suffering of self-centeredness or clinging to a sense of a separate self, we begin to see how unnecessary that concept is, and that when we let go of that concept, even for a moment in meditation, we have a more open experience, and we actually start to experience a kind of wakefulness that we can experience not only in meditation, but throughout our lives. So this teaching of interdependence and karma is central to this idea of the narrow vehicle, or focusing in on what we actually need in order to progress on the path, in order to overcome our confusion. Remember the Hinayana. Wake yourself up tonight in the middle of the night and tell yourself that. Okay. So tonight I was hoping to have more of a discussion. I know the topic of reincarnation is controversial at best. And I would really like to hear what people think about it. And so just to kick off the discussion, when we talk about reincarnation, we're not just talking about, reincarnation implies, well, you've reincarnated into something else. So it's sort of a forward-looking kind of statement that you will reincarnate. It's really the process of perpetual incarnation, I suppose, or perpetual birth or rebirth. So we say in this life we were born, we celebrate our birthday. We should really celebrate our rebirth day, right? From this perspective. It's not, born isn't something, according to the Buddha, that happens once, but it's this perpetual cycle. And so before I say too much, I'd really like to understand what everyone thinks honestly about reincarnation. Do you believe it? Or do you believe some part of it? And if so, why? Or why not? So please share. I think it will really help us to dig into this topic.
I'd like to share something on this.
Please.
Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
I find it a very, I don't want to say natural, but a very helpful focus for myself, because number one, I can be at rest in a certain way about death and dying. And number two, it makes me more responsible. I can't just trash out the planet this time around, because I'm coming back. So I like that aspect, that you reap what you sow, and it makes a certain amount of real sense for me. So I find it a very useful and helpful concept. And yes, I believe it.
So can I ask you, Bonnie, I understand that you feel that it makes sense, but why? Logically, is there any, or is it just intuitive, or why do you believe it? Or is it just an intuitive sense, or is there some rationale for that?
You know, I guess strong intuition that it's true happened when I was with my dad as he passed. I was the only person with him, and it was a really transformative death experience. And right at the moment he died, which was 12 midnight on the full moon of Easter Sunday, I put my hand on his head, and there was this huge transference of electrical energy that came out for about 2 hours, very strong, after his heart stopped and his breath stopped. And there was just a complete experience of being protected and in a holy space. And it was such a strong experience for me. It really picked me up and put me in a different place altogether.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very powerful.
It was very powerful. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. How long ago was that?
He died in 96.
Quite a while. Quite a
Mm-hmm.
time. Great. Thank you for that. Does anyone else have a opinion?
I'll speak, Bart, from the other perspective. Not having had the benefit of Bonnie's experience, I find myself a skeptic, right? Just without, and skepticism is a sort of natural attitude for me to need evidence, in a sense, before I believe something. And so, you know, for me, I'm open-minded, but have not yet seen the evidence that persuades me.
Mm-hmm. So you want, so what's the evidence? Is it scientific proof or personal experience?
Either, honestly. You know, I mean, I just need something if I'm going to adopt a belief.
Right. So, so do you have a belief then?
In this area?
Yeah.
I'd say I'm kind of agnostic. I'm inclined to think, well, that I tend to think in probabilities, right? That I tend to think that the probability is that I'm going to die and I'll be dead, and that will be it, and there will be no kind of continuation in any kind of meaningful organized form. I mean, I'm aware that the cells of my body are composed of material elements that will continue to exist in some form. But that's where I think the probability is.
So you think that's what, if you're a betting man.
Yes. That's where I'd lay my money.
So then, do you believe in taking responsibility for your own actions?
Yes.
Why? If you're not going to be around?
Well, I think the why of that is because I have the intrinsic impulse to do that. And I find that that I feel more grounded and at peace when I do that.
I see. Okay. So you have empirical evidence of that.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. Thank you for sharing and for your honesty.
Sure.
Anyone else? How about everyone else? Everyone has to say. Sheila.
I'll go. Oh, I'm sorry, Maria.
Go ahead, Alan.
Are you sure?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Well, I used to be agnostic, and I'm not anymore. And I think I got a bigger view, actually, this in terms of, you know, I think it's almost a cultural thing that we have, thinking that things are inanimate, you know, and that other beings are like machines, right? That animals are like machines, and that the world is inanimate. And I don't buy into that anymore. It seems more like there's a bigger picture, right? And actually, Bart really helped on this one time. He was at San Luis, and he was at the center. And I think there must be a rocket launch right now because everyone's yelling outside. So I must have just gone up. But at any rate, what you said, Bart, was I'd asked about how big a kalpa is with respect to the Big Bang. He said, oh, it's bigger than that. And it's like, oh, well, it's the context in which the Big Bang occurred. And that really seemed right, that there is a context in which we all live, and that context has a sort of life to it. You know, it has a material form, but it also has a living form, and that we're part of that living form. And we're not, you know, so that we come out of the earth, you know, when we leave, we don't go anywhere. You know, there's nowhere else to go because it's all part of this. And so, frankly, I don't think there's anywhere else to go, including oblivion. So it just seems to me like it must be true that we go, you know, something happens, you know, TBD. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Super. Maria?
Well, let's see. I sort of fall midway between some of this. Rob's feelings are similar to mine in some ways, although the reason that, you know, I have the experience of connection to other beings, and that occasional and fleeting non-dualism experience causes me to want to practice the Dharma, and in that way, as far as the reincarnation piece is concerned, I don't know. I do think that there is some greater intelligence, what it might look like, and how we reincarnate. I don't know. I don't know if it's in another similar life like this. I think of the reincarnation almost more in a day-to-day type of basis, where you can move through the hell realms and the God realms in any given day, week, month, year. But I think it's possible that we reincarnate as long as we're in cyclical life as we know it.
Okay. Okay, good. Thank you. Who else? Jump in.
Me?
Yes.
Hey. Hey, Bart?
Yes. Go ahead.
Is it me?
I can hear you.
Is it Vika?
Hello, Vika.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, hi, Bart.
Hi.
Okay, I'm glad to connect with you, all of you. Anyway, I do. I know reincarnation is for sure. I mean, I left my family for uh, I don't know how many more miles to walk these mountains where I live in, and I know I used to do that, and I recognize my connection with birds. I love them. I know I was a bird. Um, I recognize my connection with the Hungry Ghost because I'm still there. Um, yeah, I just know it's true.
So you feel a strong personal connection and relationship with beings, with other beings. Is that what you're saying?
All kinds of. Yes, I do, and I do
Hmm.
recognize situations where I've been into, even though I've never been there in my life,
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah,
and yeah, so
good.
that's where I am. I know it's true.
Okay, great. Thank you. Very strong,
Yeah,
intuitive
thank you.
feelings. Yeah, good. Who else have we not heard from?
I haven't shared
Okay.
yet. Um, well, I kind of had an experience as a child that set me on that mindset about reincarnation. And when I was little, I wanted to be something. There was none of. I wanted to be a dancer, and there wasn't any of that in my family or anything around me. And I remember the first day I got to walk into the dance studio, I recognized everything, and I thought, good, now I can get back to work. And it was just this very clear thing. And I've always had that sense that I've done something before or I've been around before. But as I've searched and studied, I think I had a lot of misconceptions about what reincarnation really
Hmm.
entails. I was always searching for an answer to your higher power or God or
Hmm.
whatever, and nothing resonated. Nothing answered questions for me until I found the Dharma, and now there's things that I'm learning that are really kind of are kind of frightening to me, honestly, about being reborn. And
Hmm.
I think I had this idea that it was a kind of a stepping ladder that you went up, and so if you were human, you would become human again and again and again. And I had no concept of all the different sentient beings and different
Hmm.
realms, and then working with things you've said and what Maria just talked about, that you can actually be experiencing those realms, um,
Hmm.
you know, in your day-to-day life. It's just changing constantly for me.
Hmm.
And yeah, so I do believe in it, and I just don't think I have um, the right view yet.
Hmm.
I'm
Right.
trying to learn about that. Yeah.
Very interesting. Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think Mark is the only one left. Would you like to say something?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've never had any kind of experience like a past life experience or anything like that. And I have a lot of training in science. And so like Rob, I tend to be skeptical until there's evidence that's convincing. And so, but I'm open. I'd love to see it. So I have lots of questions about reincarnation. What exactly gets reincarnated?
Mhm.
I'm a firm believer right now that consciousness is generated by a bunch of living neurons in the human brain. And when those neurons die, the consciousness goes with it.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, I can see that all my actions, my karma, all that is moving forward. I mean, after I'm gone, everything that's happened, that's been put into place, all that's going to move forward without me. And whether that's part of the mind stream or what is all very
Mhm.
unknown, and it's all very fascinating to me. And
Mm.
I love to think about it. So
Great. Very interesting. Well, that it sounds like we have the gamut of experience in terms of whether people's understanding and belief. And I do think belief is really, in a way, not so important, because beliefs are what we're trying to get rid of, after all. So clearly, just to believe something because someone else said so is not an act of discrimination. Believing something because you understand it, or you have an intuitive sense, or it relates with your personal experience, that's a different kind of belief. And that's the kind of belief that the Buddha encouraged, not blind faith. So I do think it's very healthy that we have this sense of skepticism. But as everyone was talking, I couldn't help but think, how much, I'm going to ask another question. How much do you think your belief or lack thereof, or whatever it is, your perception of reincarnation, how much is that affected by the culture in which you live? Anyone?
absolutely affected by the culture in which I live.
What's an example of the cultural aspect of reincarnation here in the US, or the absence of belief in it? That's not a trick question. What's the main cultural? A lot of people said it. Science.
Yeah.
Right?
There's no scientific evidence for it.
Yeah. People talk about evidence. I mean, a lot of people said that. And so scientific method, right?
Right.
So scientific method, is that a belief? Or is that something that's completely true?
Well, I think
I'd say it's neither true nor untrue. It's simply a method. It's a process by which we arrive at our perceptions of what is true and what is untrue.
Yes, of course that's true. And maybe I shouldn't say scientific method per se, but, we pick and choose what we think we apply that to constantly. So for example, right now you're looking at a video screen of me and a bunch of other people, and you have no idea if those people are really out there, just all staged for your benefit in a Hollywood studio someplace. When you watch the Olympics or something in China, or, and everybody watches TV, there's an agreement that that's real, that's really happening, right? There's no scientific, it's just because you believe it, right? I mean, and so there's all kinds of things that we only apply the method on certain things, and there's so much inherent belief, I think. And I know one of my favorite non-Buddhist books is the brief, what's it called? The Brief History of Time?
Right.
Stephen Hawking's, is that what it's called?
Right.
And I think one of the most beautiful things he says, and he's like one of the greatest scientific thinkers and physicists of of the recent century, and he acknowledges that science is a belief, which I thought is absolutely fantastic. He says it's no less of a belief or no more of a belief than belief in God, but it is a belief when you come right down to it. And I thought that was such an honest and a deep, profound contemplation that he must have done on that for a scientist to say that. And I do think it's true, and I think that I think there's a certain conditioning that goes along with our so-called scientific worldview, and the world hasn't looked that way to people for a very long time. So-called science, I don't know when you want to say that started. Did it start with Newton? Did it start with the scientific revolution? Is it Aristotle? Who knows where you start that? But in the history of the world, in terms of the way people experience things, it's a blip. It's a very short moment that people experience the world in terms of, you have to show me something, you have to show me the proof in order for me to believe it. And in fact, it's sort of been the opposite for a really long time. So I guess in my view, if you look at it from a bigger picture, this is a very big swing. You know how things swing one way and then they swing the other. So we've swung away from the seemingly animistic, interconnected, world of Aboriginal people where everything is connected, and there are everything, trees and animals and the moon are all beings and spirits and connected, right? And we've gone completely to the other extreme where it's very hollow in a way, and that unless something is proven scientifically, we don't believe it. So I do think there's a very big part of our culture that affects us. And if you go back, I'm not exactly sure of the source, but what I understood is in the Catholic Church, in the early years of Christianity, in the West, that reincarnation was accepted, just like it is in the East, as part of their religion, and it was squashed by the Catholic Church in order to avoid land squabbles, because priests could be married, and you don't want claims on your property. And so this whole idea of reincarnation, I can't give a reference for that, but I do know that that idea of reincarnation was a very central part of early Christian thinking, or at least that's what I've been told. So, at any rate, I'm not bringing this up to give answers. I'm bringing this up to raise questions. And I think we are very, very conditioned by our view. So even, technology, the advance of technology, the scientific viewpoint is that, or one aspect of that viewpoint, or one extreme of it, maybe you could say, is that science is advancing, that civilization is advancing, and that in the future we'll overcome all these diseases, and life will be better, and there will be longer lifespans and improvements, so that the movement of it's all evolution. Whereas the Buddhist view is, over long periods of time, it's cyclical, it goes like this, up and down. And from the Buddhist perspective, technology, the increase in technology is a wild growth of materialism and an avoidance of things that are spiritual. I'm talking about culture at large. And people have less and less time. They're more and more impatient. If you surf on the internet and a page loads in more than 3 seconds, you are, you go someplace else, right? Can you imagine? 3 seconds is the decision-making factor, right, on whether you're going to go forward or not. That's how quick it's coming, and it's come up because of this advent of materialism, I think. So from a Buddhist perspective, technology in a way is anti-spirituality. And it's not that technology is necessarily bad. It's neutral, but its general effect is that it increases grasping. People want the newest thing. You want the newest iPhone, right? Or whatever. And, there's this sense of, that technology, is improving life. Whereas I would say I was a lot happier before my first fax machine, radio, cell phone, smartphone. In terms of personal happiness, I don't think those things have helped at all. And from that sense, I think Stephen Jobs will be the instigator of, was that what he invented, negative or positive? At any rate, we're going way off field here, but I felt like this whole, when you start looking at this issue of how we're culturally, affected, it's very hard to get out of that. And I think it's really worth looking at. How much of our viewpoint is because of our culture?
Bart, can I say I think that's true. That's accurate. But when it comes to whether you want to call it a scientific or an empiricist viewpoint, I mean, first of all, I'd say that's entirely aside from the technology issue, which is just a matter of how that viewpoint is applied and what it, what the fruits of it are. But the question I would have is, well, what method are we going to have for determining what is true if it is not observation and deduction? And to me, that's that's the fundamental issue.
Yeah, so I do think the method is observation and deduction, but it's not observation and deduction of the external world so much as observation and deduction of mind. And that's really where the Buddhist teachings focus, is on, you could say Western field of knowledge is external, mostly external, whereas I wouldn't generalize Eastern knowledge, but Buddhist knowledge is about mind. And as you know, the Buddhist great masters have written as many volumes on how mind works as there are scientific treatises, probably. Maybe not anymore, but the intensity of the study of mind. And so let's look at mind then, and where do we find, is there a proof of reincarnation in our mind? And so, because that's actually, this doctrine of interdependence, or the nidanas, is generally used as the proof as the logical proof philosophically for reincarnation. So there's several aspects to this. One is the idea that reincarnation is not something that had to happen in the past to the present and the future, but it's something that's happening constantly. So birth and death, or rebirth and re-death, rebirth and death are happening constantly in every moment, which I think is a very accurate way of looking at mind. If you really understand impermanence, and that's something you have to believe, right? If you look at your mind, it is never the same. And even if it feels a little bit the same as a previous moment, it isn't the same because you've had a whole bunch of other experiences in between those two moments, which affect, you know, you have memories and you have, right? So your two moments of mind are not the same, of your own mind. And you can look at that. And so you can see the proof of impermanence right in your mind. Birth of the previous moment happens so that you can experience the present moment, which has to die so that you experience the future moment. Shamarpa used to say, if it was not for this birth and death, everything would be frozen. We'd be stuck. There would be no movement. Everything would, there wouldn't be anything because there's no way for anything to change into something else. So looking at our mind and looking deeply at the nature of impermanence, we see that there's a constant dying of the past and birth into the present and future, which happens continually. So from the perspective of the teaching of the Nidanas, so when you have a moment of consciousness, what is its necessary predecessor? What is the necessary predecessor? What has to happen the previous moment to have a moment of consciousness?
Oh, isn't it the previous moment of consciousness?
Exactly. Can matter create a moment of consciousness? Well, I think you just said that neurons do that, right?
Yeah,
so,
right.
From the Buddhist perspective, matter and mind are very different. They have a different nature. Matter is ruled by time and space, right? It has its physical characteristics. It has its duration and time. And mind is not that way. It has no limitation. It isn't, you know, Milarepa used to say, you can't lock up your mind in an iron box. You know, there's no way you can control mind through matter, through physics. So from the Buddhist perspective, mind and matter have very different natures. So matter can create further matter, right? When matter changes, it becomes something else. You can create things, you can build things, you can have inventions, you can make the newest iPhone, and you can improve computer chips. But mind only has a predecessor as the previous moment of mind. So if you look at that and you study that in meditation, you can actually see that every movement of your mind is coming from the previous movement of mind. There's a flow, right? So from the Buddhist perspective, the logical proof of reincarnation is that even at the moment of your birth, you had to have a previous moment of mind. And at the time of your death, you have to have a subsequent moment of mind. There is no other possibility because there's no other way for consciousness to arise except based on a previous moment of consciousness. So this idea of interdependence of movement of consciousness is in itself what the Buddhists would call the proof of reincarnation. But it isn't something that you know, again, as I said, when I say proof, I mean, you know, we're talking about, you know, someone asked for empirical evidence. You can find empirical evidence by meditating, by looking at your mind. And that's what the suggestion here is, not to believe something. I mean, is it helpful? The Buddha said something and you have great trust in the Buddha, and so you believe that it's true or likely to be true. I don't think that that's wrong. That's a kind of faith that's born from a certain kind of intelligence, because you trust in the words of the Buddha or the Dharma because you felt its truth so often in the past, right? You've understood, and when you've applied those teachings, they've made sense to you. So if there's a teaching that you don't fully understand or necessarily believe, you tend to have faith in it because of your previous faith, which is based on your own empirical experience. So that's good. But total blind faith is not very good. It's not very useful, because then it's someone you're too easily influenced. So somebody who's not the Buddha, who's the opposite of the Buddha, tells you something and you believe that, then you go completely in the wrong direction. So there's a kind of gullibility with blind faith that is not very helpful, and actually very dangerous. So I think the suggestion of looking at the impermanence of mind and the movement of mind through moments of consciousness, and the idea of birth and death in every moment, that to me is the domain of reincarnation that is most important. And even if you don't, you know, you can't quite extend that beyond your death or before your birth, if you understand that, and you understand that it creates happiness when you do something beneficial, you can see that in your mind, or it creates the seeds of suffering when you do something negative. As long as you take responsibility, I think that was something, I can't remember who was the first person said, taking responsibility. That's really, you know, I guess you could say from the point of view of the ultimate view, or the view of this teaching, you know, we're talking about selflessness, right? The idea of the Nidana chain, that none of them are solid. They're all, one is cause of the next, and also a result of the previous. So if it's a continual movement of cause and result, it's always changing, and it isn't solid in the sense that it has a self. And that whole cyclic chain, there isn't any self. There isn't anything that doesn't change. That those things aren't revolving like moons around a sun, and the sun or the earth, and the earth is like you as a person, and all those things are moving around. No, that's not how it works. Those things are your moments of consciousness. There is nothing else than those moments of consciousness. But because we are confused, we call that me, those movements of consciousness. And so I guess from that perspective, to me, that's the most useful way of looking at the idea of reincarnation, is this momentary experience of consciousness, and really thinking deeply about that. What does that mean? Any comments?
Bart, I'll say that's very helpful, actually. This sort of sense, what strikes me is, you know, I reflect on my experience and my thinking about this. I have a lot of affinity with Mark's kind of empiricist position, and at the same time, the idea of consciousness arising just as an epiphenomenon of brain. That doesn't make sense to me, right? On an intuitive level, or I can't see how this peculiar and remarkable experience that we have of consciousness could merely be produced by a material arrangement of chemicals. So and then the issue of, well, then where does the consciousness come from? It comes from a previous moment of consciousness. I'll say that I'll adjust my odds ratio on this issue.
We are tipping the scales. How cool is that? Interesting. Okay. On the other hand, body and mind are related, right? I've heard Tinley Rinpoche say once about the relationship between body and mind. He said that body is coagulated mind. So, in other words, they're similar, but body is just a much heavier, solidification of mind, which is that's a very Mahayana mind only kind of presentation. So here, when we start talking about nature of body and mind, we start getting into the schools and the different views, and that's, I think the scope is way beyond where we are in terms of this class. But I do think really focusing on impermanence and consciousness, the movement of consciousness, movement of your mind from one conscious moment to another, as if they're not two separate moments either. That's another artificial way of just talking. So someone asked a question, I think it was Alice, or maybe Erica. Who is it that's experiencing karma? If there is no self, then what or who is it that experiences karma? And or expressed in another way, if there is no self, to what does karma cling? So in some way, there's a fairly simple answer for this, maybe not so easy to understand, but when we talk about that there's no self or selflessness, we're not talking about a void. We're not talking about an annihilation. We're not talking about, this is, when we get into Mahayana, we talk about emptiness. So emptiness is not an absence. I mean, it's an absence of a concept, the concept of self. But the absence of a concept of self is not nothing. It's not nothingness. Trungpa Rinpoche used to define emptiness. He used to translate shunyata, the Sanskrit word for emptiness. He would translate it as fullness. Just have a little bit of a mind twist, right? So fullness, so when you experience the world without self, it's extremely full. That's what he's saying. So when we ask the question, you know, what does karma cling to if there's no self? Well, if you really have no self, then you don't generate any karma, right? But, you know, so sometimes we try to trick our logic and we say, well, karma clings to the mind stream. Well, that doesn't really help anything. That's just saying the same thing. What is a mind stream? So a mind stream without a self is, what is that? So, but I think the key point in understanding this is realizing that selflessness is not a vacuum, right? Because that's what we think of, selflessness. So I'm not here, then you go, there's no me. And then that means there's nothing, right? It doesn't mean there's nothing. It just means there's no concept of me. Those are two very, very different things. This self-referential thing that we constantly do, that's the problem. It doesn't mean that there's nothing happening or there's no experience or that there's no sentient being on a relative level. It just simply means the way we think about this is all screwed up, right? So mind is like, well, it's kind of like mind. So mind moves, right? And we know as we study our mind, consciousness gives rise to another moment of consciousness and it keeps moving, right? So there's this constant movement of mind. So the constant movement of mind, it's going, you know, positive, negative, neutral. It's just moving through all kinds of perceptions and creating karmas, right? So when you create a karma is not a thing that's a physical, it's like not like a piece of dust that has to cling to a mirror. It has to stick. Karma is mental. Remember, karma is only mental. There is no such thing as karma on a physical level. Because karma is due to motivation and motivated action. In the jewel ornament, it says karma is two things: motivation and motivated action. It's the mind and so in other words, the cause and the effect. The cause is the mind, your intention. The effect is the action that comes from that mind. There is no physical corollary to that, although there is cause and effect in the physical world, but we wouldn't call that karma. We just call that, I don't know what we call that. That's not the topic of our study. So when we create karma, we are affecting that movement of our mind. We're pushing it in a direction. And if we continually think a particular pattern, if we continually have anger, for example, we keep pushing that negative energy, that anger, onto this movement of mind. And it's part of the movement of mind. It isn't separate from it. It is a movement of mind, right? And so we're affecting how that mind moves in the future, right? When we're angry, then what's the next moment of consciousness going to be like? It's probably going to be unpleasant, right? Because anger creates unpleasant. And of course, in the future, it creates all kinds of consequences. But I'm just talking about in the very next moment. If you experience anger, you tend to be unhappy. You may not notice it, or you may not care, or you may get off on your anger, or there's all kinds of ways. You may be completely ignorant of that, but it is not a pleasant experience to be caught in anger. So a moment of anger is creating a stronger moment of anger in the future, right? That's karma right there. One moment to one moment. You can see, without having to be a Buddha and understanding the exact cause and exact result of a particular action, you can see the effect of negative and positive motivation and actions in your mind. And so, without getting too philosophical, it isn't that you don't have to have a self. You don't have to have a belief that you exist as a separate being and my name is Bart and I'm a father and I have all these concepts and I do this and I go to work and, those are all concepts. But beyond those concepts, there's this movement of the mind where that's what karma sticks to. And it isn't that it's a physical thing that it sticks, it just changes the trajectory, right? So mind is going in a particular direction. Somebody says something, makes you angry, then mind, instead goes in a different direction, right? It changes course. And that changing of the course is the karma right there. That's the karmic movement. So I think that's where, in my mind, that's kind of an experiential way of explaining how karma affects our mind and our mind stream. So it isn't just that it creates this, future effect. You can look at this right in your meditation practice. Does that make sense to people? So who asked that? Was that so Alice? Was that what we were talking about?
Hi, this is Erica here.
Hi, Erica.
A lurker. Thanks for addressing that question, Bart.
You're welcome.
I think you've made a good description of karma as, the emotional content that goes from one moment to another and influences the past, therefore influences the future. The question really is about karma and reincarnation. And this is kind of difficult. I sort of have this sort of body language acceptance of reincarnation that, I sort of believe in it, but intellectually I don't, because it kind of doesn't make sense, because, if you agree that there isn't any past, there isn't any soul to convey this, I'm still hesitant to link karma and reincarnation.
Well, you don't need a soul. You just need mind, right? From the point of view that I just explained, karma affects a mind. The soul is something extra. What is that?
It was the part about mind continuing after death and
right.
Rebirth.
Well, understood. And the point, again, I'm not here to convince anybody of anything, but if you think about, you look at your experience, every moment consciousness begets another moment of consciousness, right? So if you think about that very deeply, what happened before you're born and what's going to happen in the future? More consciousness. That's from a logical perspective, that's what the Buddhists would say is the, but,
nobody knows.
Yeah, well, I think that the Buddha was probably a pretty good source too, and he seemed to be pretty convinced about it. Yeah. I do think, I actually think, going back to what I said before, I think the cultural bias is a little bit hard for us to understand. It's hard for anyone to get out of their own cultural bias, but I think there's something very ingrained in us, and I think I only mention that as a topic of contemplation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, think in your own mind, in your own practice, how much is your view of the world affected by your culture, how you've been raised, how everyone around you thinks.
This also applies to the time of the Buddha. I mean, one explanation I've heard for reincarnation is, well, that's what everybody accepted back then.
So he just went along with the status quo.
It was part of his cultural environment.
I see.
Well, I would argue too, Bart, that you overstate the extent to which scientism and empiricism is ingrained in our culture. I would bet that of the 8 of us here, that in fact 5 or 6 at least probably were raised in an environment that very much emphasized a non-rational, non-empiricist belief structure of Christianity or Judaism. You know, that had very little to do with observation.
True. Okay. Well, yet another belief system, right? Yeah.
Corollary. Oops.
Go ahead.
Am I muted now?
No, I can hear you.
There's a corollary to this line of investigation. Is it possible for people to remember their past lives? And if so, who or what is doing the remembering?
Well, there were some people who felt very strongly about having some intuition of their past lives. I mean, obviously, from the Buddhist perspective, yes, it's possible. And the reason why we don't, let's talk about that. The reason we don't generally remember our past lives is because of the trauma of birth. I don't know how many of you are mothers, and I can't speak to this personally, but I'm told that childbirth is the most painful experience possible for the mother. And many of the Buddhist texts call it, the pain is as bad or worse than the pain of death. And apparently for the child, it's similar. And so it's funny because we think of birth as such a joyful experience. We celebrate our birthday, right? We celebrate the day where we had tremendous pain in coming into this world. Where was I going with this? I just got lost, sorry. So the trauma of the birth experience kind of wipes out our memory. That's the doctrinal explanation for why we don't just simply remember past lives.
Well,
but there are many people.
With
There are many people.
Concept of our memory. I mean,
What?
The conversation could be turned to the question of what's our memory if there's no soul, or what's the conveyance?
Well, to me, why do you have to have a soul to have memory? Memory is another movement of mind, right? We talked about karma as just affecting the movements of mind. So when you have a mind, your mind has the impressions of everything that happened before it. So a memory isn't something that a third person has to remember, the third person being me, my self, you don't have to have an actor. The memory is the movement of the mind itself. You know, I mean, it's a fundamentally dualistic way of thinking when we say, if there is no self, then how can there be memory? As if there has to be two different things, a self and something to be remembered. That's a very dualistic perspective. And what the Dharma is saying is that those aren't two separate things. It's all movement of mind. And to step outside of your experience and think that that's yourself, and look at the object of your experience, either a memory or a perception or a thought or whatever, there's this split, there's this dualistic split. But mind, the movement of mind happens independent of that duality and independent of your perception of yourself. So memory to me it's another one of those, it's movements of mind. Sometimes you're thinking about the past, sometimes you're thinking about the future, sometimes you have, all of it, it's another one of the moments of consciousness. So to me, memory doesn't negate the idea of selflessness. I mean, so you could say a thought or an emotion. Well, how could you have an emotion if you don't have a self? How could you have a thought if you don't have a self? How could you have anything if you don't have a self? Because there's no self to experience anything. So how could you have a thought? It's not just memory, it's anything. Right? So selflessness is just this plastered on concept not selflessness. Self is that we plaster on top of our experience in order to make, to make it something smaller, something more bite-sized, something we feel we can control or manage. But the actual experience of memory, I don't think you don't need a self for that, even logically. It's just another movement of mind.
So you're saying that memory is the conveyance for karma?
I mean, if we have to use a word, I'd use mind stream, or the mind is the conveyance of karma, which is not a thing, but is a fluctuating movement of one moment of consciousness to another moment of consciousness. And memory is just another one of those moments.
Can I jump into this?
Go ahead.
I've had this question a lot, and thank you for allowing us to bring this up. It's really great. The analogy that I've heard a lot of times that's really helpful is the ocean and then the individual waves being the expression of the individuals that we perceive ourselves as, are these, you've all heard that. So my question then would be, if we are these waves, this expression of natural mind and in these unique little waves that then recede back into the ocean, if that's what's happening in reincarnation, then why isn't the mind stream absorbed in the general ocean instead of coming back with its corresponding karma?
Very interesting question. And I think because of the force of the accumulation of motivated action, right? So again, if you look at your own mind, in your previous moment of mind, you have you know, your current experience of consciousness is related to the previous moment. You know, it isn't totally unrelated. So in other words, you don't suddenly experience one moment of wild anger and the next moment you're calm, and then you feel hysterical joy, and then you feel jealousy, and then you feel calm. I mean, maybe in the course of an hour you go through those, but if you actually watch the movement of the mind, it moves gradually between these states of emotion and thought and memory, and it's gradually moving, right? So what is impelling it to move is all of the previous moments of consciousness. So the previous moments of consciousness, you know, Shamarpa used to call them pushy, crowdy karmas, right? They're all pushing this amorphous mind in a direction, right? And sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative, sometimes it's happy, sometimes it's sad. Why would that stop when we die? All of a sudden, you know, every moment since we can remember, we've had a moment of consciousness and it's led to another moment of consciousness. And all of a sudden when we die, that's going to stop. That is totally illogical from that perspective, right? So what's going to happen is it's going to continue to impel future moments of consciousness in whatever form that takes, right? And so according to the Buddhist teachings, you go through, when the body dies, there's a intermediate state called a bardo where you don't have a body, but then those movements of the mind continue to impel you forward until your mind coagulates into a new body, and you go through birth and forget about where you were and you keep going. So that's the notion. I think the idea of, you know, kind of merging into the ocean, I think the analogy for that in some way is, you could say, is enlightenment. Why don't we just merge into the ocean of being? Well, I think if we shed karma, in other words, if we have no impeller, if we have nothing pushing in a direction, we don't have negative emotions that shout up because of our previous, you know, confusion. If we're free of that, then we're not being pushed, right? There's nothing pushing us anymore. We've become totally free. So we could rest in that total spaciousness of the ocean of mind. And then from the bodhisattva perspective, we could decide to be reborn, not because we're impelled to, because of our negative karma, because we want to, because we think we can help other people understand this themselves. So it becomes totally different. It may seem the same, there's a birth, right? But a birth of a bodhisattva and the birth of a sentient being are very different. One of them comes through karma, and one of them comes through bodhicitta, which is, you know, again, outside of this topic, but it's the absence of karma. Because of the complete absence of karma, and not only its absence, but the strength of our wish and vow to help other sentient beings, then we take on rebirth for a totally different, it's a different mechanism. We're not doing it because we have to. We're not doing it unconsciously. We're not doing it because we're impelled by our previous actions. We're doing it because we'd like to. It'll be challenging and fun and a cool thing to do. Let's go help some people. So I don't know. That's I'm kind of talking around your question, I think, in a way, but.
No, that addressed it.
Bart, may I ask a question?
Please.
It's wouldn't our attachment and craving in our mind stream be part of what continues that keeps us being propelled forward.
Exactly.
And and then we want to repeat. We want to continue.
Yeah.
That and be a new wave, kind of.
So this is when we were talking about the laws of karma. And I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly what the technical term was, but the karma can never be extinguished until the result is experienced, right? So if you think about it that way, and that makes sense logically from the point of view of mind. So if that karma cannot be extinguished, then what happens to all the clinging that we've done in this life and all the aggression and all the negative? Does it just disappear at the time of our death?
Well, not until we become enlightened, right?
I'm sorry?
Not until we become enlightened.
Not until we become enlightened. And that's the topic of next class is the antidotes. We'll talk about that from a very practical perspective, the antidotes to karma, to, how to overcome karma. But I mean, from the perspective of not becoming enlightened, yeah, if you become enlightened, you're extinguishing your karma. And we'll talk about that. But absent that, where does all that stuff go? Where does all your anger, where does all your clinging? You can see in the movement of your mind from one moment to another how it affects you and how it continues, and it creates suffering and happiness. So why would that stop? All of a sudden, just because you died? Why would that change anything? Any rate. Well, I really appreciate everyone's their views and how genuine this discussion is, because I think it's very helpful. And as I said before, I think blind faith is a terrible thing, even for Buddhists. I mean, I suppose I could be so, I could be a right-wing Buddhist and say, if you believe in the Buddha's words, that, that's a good thing. And maybe it is, but I think belief is a bad thing. Blind faith is a bad thing. I think it creates tremendous potential for wrong views, because you are gullible and you're influenced by other people too easily, even by the Buddha. That's not good. The Buddha wants all of us to learn how to discriminate on our own, not to learn a set of rules, but to learn what to accept and what to reject, not because he said so, but because there's an inherent truth, which you can test in terms of your own experience. So that's my suggestion in your meditation practice, is to test some of the things we've talked about tonight. If you look in shamatha practice, I mean, I don't know if you ever do this, but I do this fairly often when I'm meditating, and all of a sudden I notice I'm thinking about something really weird. I've gotten off into this storyline, and I try to remember, how did I get here? And you can try to go back through the steps. And this is a kind of a shamatha exercise. It's like, so now I was thinking about, this person at work, and how did I get to work? Oh, it was because I looked at the time, and and then I thought I have to get ready. And then, you just go back and back and back. And then somehow it started with a movie you watched last night that you had a thought of, but you can actually trace these moments. If you try to be very diligent, trace those moments of watching your mind and how your mind moves. And it's said that once your shamatha becomes so strong that you're not distracted, you can actually look back, and you can look back to the previous moments of your mind, even to your birth and before. And that's how you remember past lives. It's a function of shamatha practice. It isn't even vipassana. It's just shamatha. It's just focusing your mind, if you focus your mind that strongly and you're not distracted, you can actually see all the previous moments of consciousness where they arose from. So again, don't take my word for it, but contemplate this in your practice. Think about, you know, these movements of mind and how karma and negative and positive, how it affects you and how you feel, and see how that goes. Cool. Well, this was interesting. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I certainly did. I felt a lot more connected than sitting in a room talking to myself with a bunch of equipment. So it's very helpful for me. So I think, as we did before, we'll do, we'll recite the mantra of dependent arising, and then we'll do the closing chants. So away we go. Oh, I guess I need to share my screen. I didn't create any slides for this class, obviously. But I'll share my screen, and so you can see the words. Okay. Please join me. Om ye dharma hetu prabhava hetu tisham tathagata hyavadat tisham chaya niroda evam vadi maha shramana svaha. Om ye dharma hetu prabhava hetu tisham tathagata hyavadat tisham chaya niroda evam vadi maha shramana svaha. Om ye dharma hetu prabhava hetu tisham tathagata hyavadat tisham chaya niroda evam vadi maha shramana svaha. Om ye dharma hetu prabhava hetum tisham tathagata hyavadat tisham chaya niroda evam vadi maha shramana svaha. Om ye dharma hetu prabhava hetum tisham tathagata hyavadat tisham chaya niroda evam vadi maha shramana svaha. Om ye dharma hetu prabhava hetum tisham tathagata hyavadat tisham chaya niroda evam vadi maha shramana svaha. Om ye dharma hetu prabhava hetum tisham tathagata hyavadat tisham chaya niroda evam vadi maha shramana svaha. Okay, and then we'll do the dedication.